Edward Theodore Gein was born into a world that seemed destined for darkness. His life began on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His father, George, was a timid man, often lost in the fog of alcoholism. He struggled to hold down any job, moving from one failed venture to another. This left the family in a constant state of financial precariousness. George was a phantom in his own home, a man whose presence was felt more through his absence and the scent of stale liquor than through any fatherly guidance or affection. He was no match for the formidable will of his wife, Augusta. The family dynamic was deeply unbalanced from the very start. Augusta Gein was the true power in the household. She was a woman of fierce, almost fanatical religious beliefs. She saw sin and corruption everywhere she looked. The world outside her home was a pit of depravity, a place she was determined to shield her sons from. She held a deep-seated contempt for her husband, viewing him as a weak and useless failure. Her disdain was palpable, creating a tense and loveless atmosphere within the family home. Augusta's word was law, her pronouncements absolute. She dominated every aspect of family life, leaving no room for dissent or individual thought. Her sons, Henry and the younger Ed, were raised under this oppressive and suffocating authority. In 1914, seeking to escape the perceived wickedness of the city, Augusta moved her family. She purchased a secluded 160-acre farm outside the small, quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. This move was not about starting fresh in the idyllic countryside. It was a deliberate act of isolation. Augusta wanted to cut her boys off from the world and its temptations. The farm became their prison, a remote island where her influence could reign supreme. The nearest neighbors were miles away and the town of Plainfield was a distant concept. Here, amongst the quiet fields and whispering woods, Augusta could mold her sons' minds without interference. Life on the Plainfield farm was one of relentless hard work and spiritual indoctrination. The boys were tasked with endless chores, their days filled with toil that left little time for anything else. Augusta forbade them from making friends or engaging in any activities that might expose them to outside influences. Their only permitted reading material was the Bible, which Augusta would read to them each evening. She would interpret the scriptures with a terrifying focus on damnation, divine retribution, and the inherent wickedness of humanity, especially women. For Ed and Henry, the farm was not a home, it was a fortress designed to keep the world out and keep them trapped within its grim confines. Augusta Gein's control over her sons was total and absolute. She was a domineering matriarch who saw her primary duty as protecting them from the evils of the flesh. She preached a constant sermon of sin and damnation. In her eyes, all women, apart from herself, were instruments of the devil, vessels of temptation sent to lead men to their ruin. She hammered this belief into Ed and Henry from their earliest years. They were taught that sex was a vile act, a gateway to eternal punishment. This relentless propaganda, delivered with the fire and brimstone fervor of a zealot, warped their understanding of human relationships and their own burgeoning identities. Edward, in particular, was the target of Augusta's most intense focus. He was a shy and effeminate boy, which made him an easier subject for her psychological manipulation compared to his more rebellious older brother, Henry. Ed craved his mother's approval, a commodity she dispensed sparingly and only when he adhered strictly to her rigid code of conduct. Any sign of independent thought or normal boyish curiosity was met with swift and harsh punishment. She would berate him for his perceived weaknesses, yet simultaneously fostered a deep and unhealthy dependence on her. He was trapped in a confusing cycle of abuse and affection, leaving him emotionally stunted and utterly devoted to her. The isolation of the farm amplified Augusta's power. With no friends, no schoolmates, and no other adult figures in their lives, Ed and Henry had only their mother's twisted worldview as a frame of reference. The outside world became a terrifying and forbidden place, just as she described it. They were taught to fear their own natural impulses, to see sin lurking in every shadow. Augusta's lessons were not confined to abstract theology. She would use real-world examples, pointing out local women and branding them as whores and sinners. This constant barrage of negativity created a psychological prison far more effective than the physical isolation of their remote farm. For Ed, his mother became the center of his universe. He absorbed her teachings without question. He saw her as a paragon of purity and righteousness, a divine figure in a world of filth. This created a profound and dangerous conflict within him. He loved and worshipped his mother, yet she was also the source of his deepest fears about women and sexuality. This internal schism would fester in the lonely corners of his mind for years. He was being shaped into a man who was terrified of women, yet simultaneously obsessed with them, a psychological paradox that would have devastating and horrific consequences in the years to come. The first crack in the grim foundation of the Gein family appeared in 1940. George Gein, the alcoholic and ineffectual patriarch, finally succumbed to heart failure brought on by his years of heavy drinking. His death barely registered as a significant event within the household. For Augusta and her sons, he had long been a ghost, a non-entity whose passing simply removed a minor inconvenience. Life on the farm continued as it always had, with Augusta's rule now completely unchallenged. Ed and Henry were left to run the farm, their lives still dictated by their mother's every command. The rhythm of their isolated existence remained undisturbed, a steady beat of hard labor and religious instruction. 4 years later, in 1944, a more significant and mysterious tragedy struck. On May 16, Ed and Henry were burning marsh grass on the property when the fire grew out of control. The local fire brigade was called to extinguish the blaze. Later that evening, Ed reported to the police that his brother Henry was missing. When a search party was organized, it was Ed who led them directly to his brother's body. Henry was found lying face down, seemingly unburned, though the coroner's report would later list asphyxiation as the cause of death. Curiously, Henry had bruises on his head. Despite these suspicious circumstances, his death was officially ruled an accident. The death of his brother left Ed entirely alone with his mother. Henry had often been a buffer between Ed and Augusta. He had shown signs of rebellion, occasionally challenging their mother's tyrannical views and expressing concern over her unhealthy influence on Ed. He had even considered moving away from the farm, a thought that was heretical in Augusta's world. With Henry gone, Ed lost the only person who offered a semblance of a normal perspective. He was now the sole focus of Augusta's intense and suffocating attention. His devotion to her deepened, and he became her constant companion and caretaker, his world shrinking even further. The final pillar of Ed's world crumbled less than 2 years later. Augusta, who had been in poor health for some time, suffered a debilitating stroke. Ed nursed her with obsessive dedication, catering to her every need. On December 29, 1945, she passed away. The death of his mother shattered Ed Gein. She was his only friend, his God, the absolute center of his existence. He later described himself as being in a daze and lost. The one person who gave his life meaning was gone. The isolated farmhouse, once a prison ruled by his mother, was now his empty kingdom. He was 39 years old, and completely terrifyingly alone. After Augusta's death, Ed Gein entered a period of profound isolation and mental deterioration. The farmhouse, once a symbol of his mother's oppressive control, became a shrine to her memory. He sealed off the rooms she had used most frequently, including her upstairs bedroom, the downstairs parlor, and the living room. These spaces were left untouched, covered in dust and cobwebs, preserved exactly as they were on the day she died. It was as if he was trying to freeze time, to keep a part of her presence alive in the decaying house. The rest of the home fell into a state of unimaginable squalor. Ed lived in a small kitchen and a single bedroom, surrounded by filth, garbage, and the clutter of a man who had lost all connection to reality. His solitude was almost absolute. He worked odd jobs around Plainfield, known to locals as a quiet, harmless, and somewhat eccentric handyman. He occasionally babysat for neighbors, who saw him as a gentle soul, completely unaware of the darkness brewing within him. This public persona was a mask, concealing a life that was spiraling into a private hell. He spent his nights alone in the dark, silent farmhouse, his mind consumed by the strange and disturbing ideas that his mother had planted there. He would read voraciously, but his interests were far from normal. He became fascinated with pulp horror novels, adventure stories, and anatomy textbooks, particularly those detailing Nazi medical experiments. The loneliness was a fertile ground for his psychosis to blossom. With no one to guide or correct him, his mother's teachings warped into a grotesque new form. His intense love for Augusta, combined with her venomous views on women, created a deeply conflicted obsession. He began to yearn for a female presence, but his fear and ingrained revulsion made normal relationships impossible. He wanted to possess the femininity he had been taught to despise. This internal conflict led him down a dark path. He started to think about how he could create a woman for himself, someone who could never reject him, someone he could control completely. His thoughts turned to the dead. He began to speak of wanting a sex change and became fixated on the idea of becoming a woman. Specifically, he wanted to become his mother. In his fractured mind, the only way to resurrect the woman he had lost was to physically inhabit her. This bizarre and terrifying goal began to take shape in the lonely silence of the gein farm. He needed materials for his project, and the local cemeteries held the answers. The quiet handyman of Plainfield was about to embark on a series of secret, nocturnal activities that would remain hidden from the world until a final, bloody act brought his house of horrors into the light. The unraveling of Ed Gein's secret world began on the cold morning of November 16, 1957. Bernice Warden, the 58-year-old owner of the Plainfield hardware store, had vanished. The last customer to see her alive noted that the store's van was gone and that Ed Gein had been there the previous evening, saying he would return in the morning for a gallon of antifreeze. A sales slip for the antifreeze was found by the cash register, which was open and spattered with blood. The sheriff's son, Frank Warden, knew that Gein had a reputation for strange behavior. He told his father, Sheriff Art Schley, about Gein's unusual interest in death and horror stories. This was enough to point suspicion directly at the reclusive handyman. That evening, Sheriff Schley and a deputy drove out to the Gein farm. The property was dark and silent, an unnerving sight in the rural twilight. They found the hardware store's van parked on the premises. With a search warrant in hand, they prepared to enter the house. The doors were locked, so they forced their way in through a side door leading to the kitchen. The stench that hit them was overwhelming, a sickening mixture of decay, filth, and stale air. The kitchen was a chaotic mess of dirty dishes, rubbish, and old food cans. But it was in the adjoining woodshed that they made their first and most ghastly discovery, a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hanging upside down from a meat hook was the naked, decapitated body of Bernice Warden. She had been dressed out like a deer, her torso slit open from the sternum downwards. The horror was absolute and surreal. Sheriff Schley, a hardened lawman, was so shocked that he had to retreat from the building to regain his composure. The scene was something from a nightmare, not from the quiet, unassuming town of Plainfield. As the investigators pushed further into the house, bracing themselves against the foul odor, they realized that the horror had only just begun. The entire farmhouse was a museum of the macabre, each room revealing a new level of depravity. The search uncovered a collection of objects so bizarre and grotesque that they defied belief. They found bowls made from human skulls, a corset crafted from a female torso, and leggings made from human leg skin. Chairs were upholstered with human skin, and a lampshade was fashioned from a human face. In a box, they discovered 9 preserved female vulvas, a belt was made of human nipples, and masks created from the preserved faces of women were found scattered around. The officers also found the head of Bernice Warden in a burlap sack and the head of another missing woman, Mary Hogan, in a paper bag. The quiet farm had been hiding a charnel house of unimaginable horror. As the full extent of the horrors within the Gein farmhouse came to light, investigators were faced with a disturbing question: where had all the bodies come from? While Gein had murdered Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan, the sheer volume of human remains suggested a far more extensive operation. Under interrogation, Gein was surprisingly forthcoming. He confessed that for nearly a decade, he had been systematically robbing graves in the local cemeteries. He explained his methods with a calm and detached demeanor that deeply unsettled the police. He would read the obituaries in the local newspaper targeting the fresh graves of middle-aged women who, in his mind, resembled his mother. His process was methodical. He would wait for a moonless night and drive to the cemetery with a shovel. Working alone in the darkness, he would exhume the recently buried coffins. Sometimes he would take the entire body. Other times, he would select specific parts that he needed for his macabre creations. He claimed to have made as many as 40 nocturnal visits to 3 local cemeteries between 1947 and 1952. He insisted that he never harmed the bodies while they were alive, that his morbid craft was practiced only on the dead. He saw the cemeteries as a kind of morbid supply store, a place to gather the materials for his lonely, twisted projects. The purpose behind this ghoulish work was rooted in his desire to resurrect his mother. After Augusta died, Gein was consumed by an overwhelming loneliness and a bizarre longing to become a woman. He began to experiment with the human skin and bones he collected. He wanted to create a woman suit, a complete outfit made of real female skin that he could wear. By stepping into this suit, he believed he could literally become a woman, and in his delusion, bring his mother back to life within himself. The masks, the leggings, the corset, these were all components of this horrifying ensemble. It was his desperate, insane attempt to conquer his loneliness and reunite with the only person he had ever loved. The creation of these objects was a form of ritual for gein. He would work in his cluttered, filthy kitchen, surrounded by anatomical charts and taxidermy manuals. He tanned the skins and treated the bones, transforming the remains of the dead into household items and clothing. The skull bowls were for his use, the skin lampshades to cast a soft glow on his work. This was not the act of a simple killer, but of a deeply disturbed individual attempting to build a new reality for himself from the remnants of the dead. The farmhouse was not just a home, it was his workshop, his sanctuary, and the physical manifestation of his shattered psyche. When the world learned of Ed Gein's crimes, the immediate assumption was that he was a sexually motivated killer, a monster driven by sadistic lust. However, the psychological evaluation that followed his arrest painted a very different picture. Gein was not a sadist in the conventional sense. He did not derive pleasure from inflicting pain. In fact, he was found to be a deeply repressed and sexually dysfunctional individual. His mother's relentless indoctrination had filled him with such a profound fear and disgust for sex that he was likely impotent. His crimes were not driven by sexual urges but by a complex and severe psychosis rooted in his pathological relationship with his mother. Gein was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. His mind was a fractured landscape of delusion and fantasy. His fixation on his mother was the central pillar of his illness. He had what is known as a Madonna whore complex, but in an extreme form. For him, his mother was the perfect, pure Madonna, while all other women were profane whores. After she died, he was unable to process the loss. His grief curdled into a desperate, psychotic mission to reincarnate her. The grave robbing and the creation of the woman suit were not acts of necrophilia, they were part of a magical, ritualistic attempt to bring his mother back by becoming her. His two confirmed murders, those of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, were acts of grim necessity in his delusional world. He told investigators that he had shot them because they resembled his mother. It is believed that as his mental state deteriorated and the bodies from his grave-robbing expeditions decayed, he needed fresh materials for his projects. The murders were not committed out of anger or lust, but as a means to an end. They were transactional, like a trip to the store to get supplies. This cold, detached logic is a hallmark of his severe mental illness, highlighting his complete disconnection from the reality and morality of his actions. Ultimately, Ed Gein's story is a tragic case study in the devastating effects of psychological abuse and extreme isolation. Augusta Gein did not pull the trigger or wield the knife, but her tyrannical influence created the monster who did. She systematically destroyed her son's ability to form healthy relationships, instilled in him a terrifying fear of his own humanity, and left him adrift in a sea of psychosis. When he was finally left alone, his broken mind could not cope. Ed Gein's horrors were not born of evil in the classic sense, but from a profound and tragic madness that had been nurtured for decades in the lonely quiet of the Plainfield farm. Following his arrest in November 1957, Ed Gein readily confessed to the murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. The community of Plainfield was in a state of shock, unable to reconcile the image of the quiet, odd handyman with the ghoulish butcher whose house contained such unspeakable things. The Gein farmhouse itself became a morbid tourist attraction, drawing crowds of curious onlookers. Before it could be properly preserved as evidence, it was destroyed by a mysterious fire in March 1958, widely believed to be an act of arson by locals who wished to erase the stain on their town. Gein, upon hearing the news, simply shrugged and said, "Just as well." Gein was initially put on trial in 1958, but he was found legally insane and unfit to stand trial. The court determined that he did not understand the charges against him and was incapable of assisting in his own defense. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Walpoon, Wisconsin. There, he became a model inmate. He was quiet, polite, and cooperative with the staff. He performed simple tasks and caused no trouble. For the doctors and nurses who cared for him, he was not a monster, but a gentle, childlike old man. a stark contrast to the creator of the House of Horrors. A decade later, in 1968, doctors determined that Gein's mental state had improved enough for him to finally stand trial. The purpose was not to send him to prison, as he was still considered insane, but to formally resolve the case. The trial was a bench trial, heard by a judge without a jury. It focused solely on the murder of Bernice Worden. Gein was found guilty, but because he was legally insane at the time of the crime, he was sent back into the care of the state's mental health system. He spent the remainder of his life institutionalized, first back at Central State Hospital and later at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. Ed Gein died on the 26th of July, 1984, at the age of 77, from respiratory failure complicated by cancer. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in the family plot, next to the graves of his mother, father, and brother. His final resting place was just a short distance from the graves he had once desecrated. For years his gravestone was chipped away by souvenir hunters, a grim testament to his enduring notoriety. Eventually the stone was stolen in 2000 and has never been recovered. The final chapter of The Butcher of Plainfield closed, but the story of his crimes was just beginning its long, dark life in popular culture. The story of Ed Gein is so profoundly disturbing that it burrowed deep into the American psyche. It was a true crime that felt more like a gothic horror novel, and it was inevitable that it would inspire storytellers. The first and most direct adaptation came just a few years after his arrest. In 1959, author Robert Bloch published his novel Psycho, drawing heavily on the Gein case. Bloch lived only a few dozen miles from Plainfield and was fascinated by the idea of a seemingly harmless, quiet man living a secret life of unimaginable horror. His character, Norman Bates, a shy motel owner dominated by the memory of his deceased mother, was a clear reflection of Ed Gein. When Alfred Hitchcock adapted Psycho into his landmark 1960 film, the shadow of Ed Gein was cast across cinemas worldwide. The film's shocking twist, that Norman Bates was dressing in his mother's clothes and committing murders while embodying her personality, was lifted directly from the psychological profile of Gein. Norman's taxidermy hobby, his isolated home looming over the motel, and his fractured psyche all echo the real-life horrors of Plainfield. Psycho transformed the horror genre, moving it away from supernatural monsters and proving that the most terrifying monster could be the quiet man living next door. This was Gein's most direct and powerful influence on culture. The Gein case continued to inspire other iconic horror villains. The 1974 film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre featured the character Leatherface, a hulking killer who wears masks made from the skin of his victims. This gruesome detail is a direct reference to the skin masks found in Gein's farmhouse. While the film's narrative of a cannibalistic family was fictional, its most visceral and memorable element, the mask of human flesh, was pure Ed Gein. Similarly, the character of Buffalo Bill in the 1991 thriller The Silence of the Lambs is a composite of several real-life killers, but his primary motivation of creating a woman suit from the skin of his victims is undeniably taken from Gein's twisted ambition. The story of Ed Gein remains so frightening because it dissolves the line between reality and nightmare. Unlike vampires or werewolves, Ed Gein was real. He was a product of a dysfunctional family and a sick mind, a man who walked among his neighbors without anyone suspecting the depths of his depravity. His crimes reveal a terrifying truth, that the most monstrous acts are not committed by demons, but by human beings. The legacy of the Butcher of Plainfield is a chilling reminder that the capacity for unimaginable horror can lie dormant behind the most ordinary of faces, waiting in the quiet darkness of a lonely house.